Hi, I'm Catherine Porter. I'm an independent energy consultant and founder of the consultancy What Logic. I've been asked to record a response to the recent interview that Robert Peston did with Conservative Party leader Kemi Badenoch on the subject of renewables and the cost of renewables and whether bills could be reduced simply by accelerating the progress to renewable generation. And this is in the context of the Conservatives having essentially repudiated the net zero 2050 target. So I'm going to do that in this video. I'm not going to show the original interview, partly because of copyright reasons and also because I really just can't bear to listen to it again. The triumphalist tone and the gotcha atmosphere that they were creating around the presentation of data, where they were using data very selectively, inappropriately, and drawing all the wrong conclusions, is just something I really can't stand to listen to again. So I'm going to use some screenshots to show you what they were talking about, explain what they were saying, and explain why it just really was incorrect. And so here we go. And I will. So the segment began with this chart that was from a report by UK Steel. And they're comparing the UK, German and French power prices, saying that wholesale costs of electricity are the reason, and in the steel report it was the reason that UK made steel is uncompetitive. Now yes, we do have higher wholesale prices than France, which uses mostly nuclear energy, and Germany, which mostly uses coal. Nuclear will always be cheaper, but in the UK no government in decades has been willing to commit to the construction of new nuclear. And so this isn't really a party political point that can be scored. The French electricity will always be cheaper than British electricity because they made the decision to invest heavily in nuclear power. Now Germany uses coal. Coal is cheaper than gas. This is true. But what the UK Steel report goes on to say is that while they want to take advantage of German-style coal-based wholesale power prices, they want to avoid the additional carbon costs that are associated with that higher use of coal. Essentially, they want to have their cake and eat it. And also what's quite interesting from that UK Steel report is that German steelmakers are not profitable. German steelmakers are also loss-making, and even if we had the exact same electricity prices that they have in Germany, British steel companies also would not be profitable. And the reason for this is that steel producers in the US and in South Korea, Japan and China benefit from significant government subsidies. And this is why primarily our steel industry is uncompetitive. So this entire analysis is really something of a red herring. Now they then went on to talk about household electricity prices, and they presented this chart apparently from Simon Evans at Carbon Brief. Now I have been unable to find this chart anywhere. Carbon Brief did publish some analysis back in 2022. This chart obviously is more recent than that. One thing that immediately strikes me here is that there's a significant cost component that's missing from the key at the right hand side, and that is supplier operating costs and supplier operating profit. Together, those make up 15% of our bills. So it's kind of curious that that isn't shown here when they are showing VAT, which is only 5%. Now, the other thing that's important to note, because I can't identify the source of these data, I'm just going to have to talk through this in a narrative way. Now, the green levies that are reported by Ofgem actually come in two different components. They include the contracts for difference and capacity market costs within the wholesale category. And then they include the renewables obligation, the feed-in tariff and the green gas levy in the policy costs category. Now here Carbon Brief has attempted to separate out social policy costs, which are things like the Warmer Homes Discount and the energy company obligation, from green levies, but it's very unclear whether that green levies includes the CFD and capacity market costs, which Ofgem hides within the wholesale brackets, or not. In any case, collectively, green levies are 5.6% of current bills. So again, comparable with the VAT level. But that's not the end of the story when it comes to the cost of renewables. Huge amounts of renewables costs are also hidden within the network cost. These are the higher cost of connecting renewables. Renewables have low energy density. It means you have to have a lot more wires to connect the same amount of generation as you would for a conventional generator. If you wanted to build an 800 megawatt gas power station, you would need a single set of wires. The equivalent wind farm would need 60 turbines to be connected. But because wind only has a capacity factor of 35%, on an equivalent annual energy basis, you would need 3 times that amount, so 180 times more wires. And obviously that costs a lot of money. Then you also have the higher balancing costs associated with renewables, where real-time intermittency has to be managed. This means every gust of wind, and every cloud passing over the sun impacts output in real time, and it costs money to manage that. And together these costs plus the curtailment costs, which is where you have to turn down wind because you can't actually transport it to where the customers are, they add billions of pounds a year to electricity bills. Collectively, in fact, 40% of balancing costs are probably associated with renewables. Now, clearly, those billions of pounds are shared between households and industry, but these are significant components of the bills. So moving on to this next chart. Now, the implication that is made in this interview is that the UK is somehow unusual in using gas to set its electricity prices. This is completely untrue. Every country in the world of any significance is using marginal pricing as their method of setting wholesale prices. And this chart here relates purely to wholesale prices, and wholesale prices are 40% of the electricity bill. So when they say that gas sets electricity prices 98% of the time, first of all, this is incorrect in terms of the data themselves. I have analysed daily gas and electricity wholesale prices between 2014 and 2024 and found the R squared was 93%. So therefore gas explains 93%, not 98% of wholesale electricity prices. And that, of course, is only 40% of the electricity bill. And so I'll explain a little bit about this marginal pricing. Marginal pricing describes the way that the wholesale power price is set. And essentially what happens is that you will deploy your cheapest generation first in terms of which has the cheapest short-run marginal cost of generation. And typically that starts with being wind and solar, because once it's built, it doesn't really cost you anything to run it. And then nuclear is very cheap. And then eventually gas tends to be the most expensive. And your older gas power stations will be more expensive than the newer ones because they're less efficient. Now, the market price is based on the last generator that you need to turn on to meet demand. So each time you add a new generator, because the previous cheaper ones weren't enough to meet demand from all the consumers, that final one that you add sets the price. So it doesn't actually matter how many gas power stations are running at the time. It matters that just at least one is. And so this next chart was showing, and they were trying to say here that, oh, the UK has higher prices because we use more gas. Well, that's not correct. It's because gas sets the power price more often. If in every market, every day, you needed at least one gas power station, they would all be setting off gas, irrespective of the overall share of gas within the generation mix. And if you remember, the government claims that gas is being set by international gas prices. That would imply that we all pay the same price for gas, and therefore the impact on the power price should be the same in all of these countries. Now, in France, most of the time, the power price is being set by a combination of nuclear and hydro. 78% of their generation is nuclear and about 15% is hydro. So the number of times that gas sets the price is relatively small. It sets the price much more often in Germany. In Germany, they have a significant amount of wind generation and brown coal, which is the dirtiest form of coal, and then also gas. We don't have coal anymore in Britain. We have very little hydro, and so gas is setting the price pretty much all the time, in fact, in Britain. Now, the whole interview concluded with the comment, if you want to get bills down, we should move faster towards renewables and away from gas. Well, the answer to this question is actually no. The more renewables that you add, the more policy costs rise. Now here it's important to understand how we're subsidising renewables. When we talked earlier about wholesale prices only being 40% of the bill and having these policy costs, well, a portion of those policy costs are renewable subsidies. The way we subsidise renewables now is through the Contracts for Difference scheme. The Contracts for Difference set what we call a strike price, which represents the price at which the generator is willing to build the wind farm or the solar farm. If the wholesale price is higher than the strike price, then the generator will pay the difference to the government, and that's distributed as a discount on our bills. However, if the wholesale price is lower than the strike price, then consumers top up that difference. And in fact, the only time that generators ever paid because the price was higher than the strike was during the gas crisis. The most recent Contracts for Difference round, called Allocation Round 6 or AR6, the strike price for offshore wind was £83 in 2025 money. Now, it's worth remembering that the strike prices are always quoted in 2012 money, so you need to inflate them to understand today's cost. Now, today's price for wholesale electricity is also £83. And in fact, the average price in 2024 was £73. So in other words, our most recent subsidy round priced £10 per megawatt hour higher than the market price. Renewables require a higher market price than gas in order to be built. And we understand that the next subsidy round will be even higher again, because the government is talking about extending the contracts from 15 to 20 years and only setting the budget after it's received bids from generators, from developers rather, which suggests a weakening of the cost control. As you add more renewables to the grid, you will have more of these subsidies. For every pound that you reduce the wholesale cost, you will add a pound to the subsidy cost, and therefore there will be no impact on the bill. But in fact, the bills will go up, because by lowering the wholesale price of electricity, you now make the cost of backup more expensive, since those backup generators will no longer earn the money they require in the wholesale market, and their costs won't fall. So in order for them to be able to cover their fixed costs and remain in the market, they will require a higher capacity price. And of course, that gets paid for through bills. The more renewables you have, the more you have to pay to connect them, and the more you have to pay to manage their intermittency. And all of that also gets added onto bills. So in fact, the more renewables you have, the higher your bills will be. And this is demonstrated by this chart here. This chart shows the dark blue line is wholesale gas prices going back to 1997. The pale blue line is wholesale electricity prices back to 1997, and the red line is the household spend on electricity. Now, what we can see really is that from up until about 2006, the gap between retail and wholesale electricity prices was relatively constant. But from that time onwards, and where the arrow is, you can see a significant divergence between wholesale and retail electricity prices. Now, this shrunk in 2022 because we had effectively a pause on the recovery of green levies through bills. But in fact, in 2023, we saw wholesale prices falling dramatically, and yet household spend went up. And this is despite the fact that demand actually fell in response to higher prices. So what we learn from this chart is, number one, gas was incredibly cheap for 20 years. Before 2021, gas was extremely cheap, and we benefited from those cheap gas prices up until 2026, when something else started to drive our electricity bills. And what was that thing? It was the transition to renewables. Since 2006, we have spent almost £220 billion in today's money on trying to develop renewable generation, and we would have saved that cost had we just stuck with gas pricing. And that's despite the significant spike in gas prices that we saw as a result of the Ukraine crisis. So this whole analysis of, oh, well, renewables make your bills lower, is just not supported by the data. And we need to move away from this. wholesale prices are only a small component of our bills. If we set the wholesale prices based on the short-run marginal cost of wind and solar, which is almost zero, all that would do would be make the gap between the wholesale price and the bill higher. It wouldn't reduce the bill at all. And it's really important that people understand that. So this gotcha moment that Robert Peston and his colleagues were trying to produce was simply not at all what it looked like.